Good morning. Welcome to the Washington edition of our state webinar series, exploring the findings from American Farmland Trust's recently released Farms Under Threat, the State of the States report. Before we get started, let me run through some logistics to help make this a good experience. Everyone has been muted, so no need to do that yourself. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can do so by going to the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. The orange arrow at the top of that panel allows the panel to shrink and reopen. You'll see a questions section of that control panel. You can pop that section out by clicking on the little square on the right-hand side. That decouples it from the control panel. Once it's decoupled, you can type your questions or comments in there, and we have two periods where we will have a question and answer opportunities. We are recording the webinar and will send the recording link to everyone who is registered. Please feel free to share this recording with others. So let me now introduce myself. I'm Chris Coffin. I'm American Farmland Trust's Senior Policy Advisor. I also direct our newly launched National Agricultural Land Network, which I'll talk about at the end of the webinar. Co-hosting with me is Addie Canib. Addie is our Regional Director for the Pacific Northwest and is based in Bellingham, Washington. Apologize, Addie, for mispronouncing your name. And for those of you not familiar with AFT, let me do a quick introduction. American Farmland Trust is a national nonprofit membership organization founded in 1980. We work to save the land that sustains us by protecting farmland, promoting sound farming practices, and understanding that it's not farmland without farmers, keeping farmers on the land. Some know us best by our No Farms, No Food bumper sticker. We work from kitchen tables to the halls of Congress, from farmland protection projects to soil health initiatives, to training service providers around land access strategies for next generation farmers and ranchers, to state and federal policy development and advocacy. We have 6 regional offices and a national office located in Washington, D.C. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Addie.
Thanks, Chris. I want to start by acknowledging that while we're convening virtually today, most, if not all of us, occupy land that historically belonged to the indigenous peoples of this region. And I also want to name that today is Juneteenth, a day that commemorates the end of slavery in the United States. I offer these points because we really can't talk about the future of our farmland in this country without facing the reality that our food and agricultural systems are bound up in a legacy of racial injustice, especially when it comes to land access and ownership. And I just want to say that AFT is committed to undoing racism within our sphere of influence. And to this end, we invite and will foster deeper collaboration with partners in the field to realize a more just and equitable food and agricultural system. And given the complexity of the work ahead of us, I'm pleased to say that we have over 100 people representing 50 agencies, organizations, and businesses registered for this webinar today. I want to recognize a few of those valued partners, including Washington State Senator Christine Rolfs and State Representatives Mary Dye, Tom Dent, and Joe Schmick, USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Washington State Conservation Commission, Department of Ecology, Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Natural Resources, Department of Commerce, Washington State University, and numerous land trusts, county governments, and local tribes. Thanks to all of you for being here today. And now I'd like to introduce a very special guest joining us, Derek Sandison, Director of the Washington State Department of Agriculture. Director Sandison has been leading the Department of Agriculture for 5 years now, and previously he served as Director of the Department of Ecology's Office of the Columbia River, where he oversaw numerous water supply development projects important to farmers and ranchers. Welcome, Director Sandison.
Yeah, thank you, Eddie. Pleased to be here.
We thought that we would start by getting your perspective on farmland conversion. And so I wanted to first ask you, why you think the people of Washington State should care about the loss of farmland.
Sure. Thanks. First, let me say I really appreciate the work that American Farmland Trust does nationwide for agriculture. It's very important, and I guess I would start with Chris already mentioned the bumper sticker, but I mean, it says a lot. It's simple: no farms, no food, but that captures an awful lot in terms of what we need to consider around maintaining the farmlands in not only Washington State but the rest of the country. Over the next 3.5 decades, we're going to need to double the supply of food worldwide, pretty much on the same amount of land and with the same amount of water that we have today. So the demand for food will be increasing every decade, and again, it will soon reach a point where the demand is doubling what we're seeing. So I think if any of you were in a grocery store in the months of April, at least in Washington State, you saw what the shelves look like. And we saw a strain to the food supply system that was frankly stunning to me, that we were seeing such a shortage of food in a land of relative abundance. And part of it was because we were facing a pandemic, so it's a worldwide effect, and certainly every state in the United States had some effect from this. And so the demand overall in the U.S. went up as people started preparing for shelter in place or stay at home, whatever. But we do know now that our food supply chain is more delicate, more fragile than we had previously thought. So it's reinforced the need to say that, we need to keep our farms and our farmers producing and providing the needed food supplies that we all depend on. I think in a larger sense, too, I think we have to think about what sort of benefits we receive from farms, the ecosystem services, carbon sequestration, aesthetics, in some cases habitat. So it's not all just production of crops and produce. It's also important to keep in mind that not all land in terms of productivity is equal. So while on balance we maintain about 7.4 million acres of cropland in Washington State, we're in some cases trading higher productivity lands for less productive land. So very important to keep your eye on the ball on this and to make sure that we are looking out for maintenance and protection of our valuable ag lands.
Thank you. Washington is one of the top 12 states in the nation in addressing the loss of farmland. What do you attribute our success to?
Well, I think there is a heightened realization in Washington about the importance of farmland. And I think we value the existence of farmlands. I mean, many people, like from the Seattle area, enjoy driving north to see the tulips in the Skagit Valley and see other crops growing. There's been a highly committed core of people that work on programs like developing conservation easements or acquiring conservation easements. Of course, going back to the early 90s, the state legislature put in place the Growth Management Act and critical area ordinance requirements that help to preserve farmlands of long-term significance and to put other measures in place to prevent conversion, or not prevent, but to slow at least the conversion of those lands into urban uses. So I think there's a broad realization of the importance of farming and its place actually in the state's economy as the number 2 economic driver for the state.
Great. And last question for you is, as we'll see when we look at the findings from Farms Under Threat, farmland conversion is still a challenge in Washington despite the work that you've mentioned. So how can stakeholders, particularly those who are joining us today, help to keep this issue front and center?
Well, I think certainly working with and supporting, we have a number of legislators on the phone that are very active in this arena, making sure that we have the overall statewide framework in place for preserving farmland and making sure that that we retain those lands that are so important to us. I think one thing I haven't mentioned yet that's very important is that I think we need to look at this from the standpoint of the farmer. The farmer, no matter what kind of measures you want to put in place to protect or prevent conversion of farmland, it's only going to be useful if the farmer wants to continue farming, which means that if you're farming, it is not, you're not making a decent living, you're not feeling that it's rewarding, you're not going to want to continue to farm. So the most important thing that we can do is make sure we put structures in place, connecting farmers to markets where they can sell their product, where they can put it in, make sure that to the extent that we can, that they have the ability to sell products that they produce. This is a particularly challenging year because of COVID-19 in terms of reconnecting farmers, and including many thousands of we call small scale farmers who are grossing under 50,000 a year. Who lost, maybe they had a connection with a restaurant or a farm school program that they no longer have access to. I think this is a very important year for us all to work together to try to reconnect, or maybe it's a new connection, but connect our farmers and producers with markets.
That's such a perfect way to frame this conversation. I'm really glad that you made that point, that this isn't just about the farmland, it's also about the farmers and ensuring that the work is rewarding and economically viable. So thanks for bringing that perspective. We really appreciate your leadership on these issues. And I want folks to know that Director Sandison will be staying on the webinar with us. So if you have specific questions for him, you can type them into the chat and we'll address them at the end. Director Sandison, thanks again so much for being with us today. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Chris to start digging into the data.
Thanks, Addie.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Director Sandison, and thank you, Addie. Just to clarify, when Addie said type your comments or questions into the chat, I think you don't have a chat button, you only have a question button. So the question can be used again for comments, questions, anything you would like to chat about, but you'll find it under that little questions part of the control panel. So let's talk now about the findings from Farms Under Threat. Today we're focusing on the State of the State, which is the second in our research series. State of the States paints a striking picture of the threats facing working farms and ranches in every state and documents the steps every state has taken to protect their agricultural land base from development. We used a multi-pronged approach that included advanced spatial mapping to identify the threats to agricultural land and an in-depth analysis of state policy responses. We're using this report to raise public awareness, inform state and federal policy, and encourage more direct and permanent agricultural land protection. And if we can have the next slide, Beth. Actually, the next one after that. So for those of you who did not join us last month, let me touch very quickly on our national findings. From 2001 to 2016, a period of historically low housing starts, the U.S. still converted 11 million acres of agricultural land. That's the equivalent to all the land planted in the United States to fruits, nuts, and vegetables in 2017. The majority of that conversion was to low-density residential land use. We've known this type of conversion was happening because all across the country, scattered large lot housing has been fragmenting and disrupting farming and ranching for years. But until this report, no one has ever been able to map it and measure it. And once we mapped it, we realized just how big of a threat it is. Importantly, More than 1/3 of the land that was converted over this time period, so about 4.5 million acres, was what we have identified as nationally significant land. And we'll talk about that, but that's land that we have identified as being best suited for intensive food and crop production. Next slide. As you can see from this map, agricultural land conversion is a growing problem across the US and no longer confined to large metropolitan areas. Small cities are sprawling, and the proliferation of farmettes and ranchettes on their outskirts has created hotspots of conversion in virtually every state. So now we're going to dive into the data available for Washington on our new interactive website built just for this project. Addie and I will be assisted in our website navigation today by our colleague Beth Fraser, so thank you, Beth, for this. Let's start with pointing out the tab over on the right-hand side, the Reports and Data tab. This is where you'll find the fact sheets that describe methodologies used in this project. If you are interested in getting access to the geospatial data we used, we will be providing this for free. You will find a form to request it that is where Beth is pointing the cursor, that geospatial data layers tab right there. It takes you to a form that you can fill out, and we will be sending information, letting people know about what will be available and when in the next couple of weeks. Let's go now to the drop-down menu over here and choose Washington. And here you will find both the spatial mapping and the policy scorecard. And we're going to start with the spatial data. We first want to point out this Washington conversion summary. So here we have created for each state 2-pagers. There's one for the spatial data, there's one for the policy scorecard that is an easily downloadable, even for those of us with terrible internet, that can be used for a number of different purposes, for information that you can provide to members, that can go out in newsletters, that can go to policymakers, many different uses. We hope you will find it helpful. So now we're going to go back and look at the 4 categories of spatial data we've created. And we're going to start with land cover and use. Farms Under Threat, the State of the States, uses multiple national data sets to develop the best available spatial inventory of agricultural land use in the US. You can zoom in on this data layer to identify every type of land use in the state, including land that we've identified as low-density residential development. It includes federal lands permitted for grazing. It also includes a first-ever attempt to spatially identify woodland associated with a ranch or a farm. Our mapping shows about 15.4 million acres of agricultural land in Washington, including almost 6.9 million acres of rangeland, 6.7 million acres of cropland, 1.5 million acres of pasture land, and 305,000 acres of that woodland associated with a farm or a ranch. So let's go to PVR values. For Farms Under Threat, we wanted to analyze the quality of land that is being lost to development, not just the quantity. So we created, with the help of a national panel of experts, an index to quantify the productivity, versatility, and resiliency of every acre of land in the US. And so you're looking at this map, which shows the range of these PVR values across the state. The darker the green, the higher the PVR value. And the higher the PVR value, the higher the suitability of that land for long-term intensive crop production, especially for food crops such as fruits, nuts, vegetables, and staple grains. So let's go, Beth, to nationally significant. These PVR values were used to identify nationally significant land. And this map, these dark green areas are what we have identified as nationally significant. You'll see that about 6 million acres of ag land falls into this category, which is about 39% of the state's ag land base. Virtually all of it, about 5.5 million acres, is cropland, with the rest divided between the other three categories. And I want to get to one of the points that Director Sanderson made, that in part we're pointing this out because the loss of this highly productive land has both economic and environmental implications. When land that is very highly productive is impacted by development, that intensive food production is pushed to more marginal lands, which has an impact, an economic impact, because input costs are typically higher and crop yields are typically lower. And it has environmental implications because soils typically degrade far more rapidly. Before we go, Beth, do you want to switch to show the satellite? And this is just, again, we're showing you how you can use this data layers to again see that the nationally significant land shows up in these green. All of this sort of nice lighter green is the nationally significant land. And it gives you, you can make it more or less transparent, which gives you a sense of what the land base is underneath it. So let's go to the last category, which is conversion. This data looked at a 15-year period from 2001 to 2016. Again, a period of low housing starts with a deep recession in the middle of it. We mapped the conversion of land to two types of land use. The first is urban and highly developed land use. This includes the traditional culprits in farmland conversion. So expanding residential, commercial, and industrial areas typically found in cities and towns. However, this category also includes rural, industrial, and energy production sites, so it will pick up oil and well pads and solar panel installations of a certain size. The second type is low-density residential development, which we've labeled as LDR. This is the first effort of its kind to quantify the extent of large lot housing on the agricultural land base. So LDR areas range from lower density subdivisions to rural areas where more and more individual houses are being built. You can see if you, well, Beth is in full screen mode, but when you can look at the numbers on the side, that you can see the conversion in Washington was split fairly evenly, thank you, Beth, between urban and highly developed and LDR over this time frame, with 51% converted to urban and highly developed, 49% to low density residential development. And a couple of points about low density residential development. There may well be lands designated as LDR in our analysis, which are being farmed. And again, as Director Sanderson said, that some of these smaller farm parcels can be highly productive and highly profitable. But we also know that LDR tends to be a transitional land use. Land in Washington that was considered LDR in 2001, when we first looked at it, was 70 times more likely to be converted to urban and highly developed land by 2016 than other agricultural land. And that's in part because of the increased management challenges for producers who are trying to farm in and around non-farming neighbors. Total agricultural land converted over this 15-year period was 97,800 acres. Pasture land accounted for about 38,000 of that, followed by cropland with 33,000 and rangeland with about 20,000 acres. And in looking at the PVR values of the land that was converted, more than half of that conversion was land in the top half of the state's PVR values, so land with higher suitability for intensive food and crop production. So let me stop there and turn it over to you, Addie, for some additional perspectives on the spatial findings.
Thanks, Chris. I think it's interesting when we look at this map to just note how historically we've worried about and focused on the impacts on farmland from urban sprawl primarily along the I-5 corridor in Western Washington. And to be sure, we continue to see consistent farmland loss all the way from Clark County all the way up to Whatcom County. But I think what's powerful about this map is that we're also seeing significant conversion in the eastern part of the state. And this is connected to some rapid population growth in those communities. Between 2018 and 2019, Franklin, Benton, and Kittitas counties saw faster rates of population growth than many other parts of the state. And cities like Pasco, Richland, and Kennewick have ranked in the top 20 cities for fastest population growth in that same time period. So I think this mapping shows how that growth is starting to impact our farmland in those areas. And we're going to talk more about policy in just a minute, but I think it's important to note that some of these communities are places that have fewer local resources to invest in farmland protection than those counties on the west side of the state. The other thing that I wanted to point out is how the growth of metropolitan areas is impacting farmland across county jurisdictional lines. This is obviously the case in the Seattle metropolitan area, but we also see it in the Wenatchee and Tri-Cities areas. And what this means is that coordination and alignment between counties is going to be, and has been and continues to be really important here. And now I'm wondering if Director Sandison would like to comment on any of the spatial findings.
No, it's certainly, Addie, what we're seeing on the ground. I mean, we followed this year by year, and as I indicated, and I threw out a number earlier of 7 million acres, 7.4 million acres of crop land. That's not total ag land. We've been losing significant amounts of non-crop land. This would be like grazing lands in particular, but that's dropped from something like 21 million acres. Or the total amount of all ag lands dropped from like 21 million, 14 million total, and of that 14, then 7 is actually devoted to crops themselves. But with those conversions that you're talking about in the Tri-Cities area, around Spokane, Yakima, and certainly in some regions of Puget Sound, that's something we were tracking all the time. And as I said, we're in many cases while we're not necessarily losing cropland, we're trading higher productive lands for lower productive lands, and it's a troubling scenario long term in terms of, again, maintaining the overall agricultural output of the state and our ability to produce the amount of food that we need to serve not only our population but others outside of Washington.
Thanks for that, and I think you're absolutely spot on that this development is, as we've already said, disproportionately impacting some of our most valuable land, and really it's a phenomenon that really requires our attention. So I'd like to turn it back over to Chris to start taking us into some of the policy findings.
Great, thank you, Addie. Before we do that, we want to stop and get some input from all of you. We're interested in your perspectives on what you think will drive agricultural land conversion over the next 10 to 20 years. And we ask this now before we get into policy, because it's good to be thinking about what more policies are needed based on what we think are going to be those drivers. So you see here, is it going to be, as the director said, what has been sometimes been challenges to agricultural profitability and wanting to ensure that farmers and ranchers see that it's profitable and rewarding to stay in farming? Is it more development? Is it climate change? Is it this generational transfer? So we're curious what you all think are going to be the drivers for conversion. You can, I think, vote for more than one. And if you're having trouble voting, it might be that you're in full screen mode and you have to go out of that mode to vote. So we'll take a minute to let people vote. Okay, here we go. So this is really useful to see because of the tie between both poorly planned and more housing, commercial industrial development, and generational transfer. So, and with a strong third of weak ag viability. So thinking about policies that can address all of these issues, not forgetting obviously about climate change and energy development as well. But let's turn now to the policy scorecard. Our intention with this scorecard is to highlight effective elements of state policies that address these drivers of conversion that we've been talking about. While AFT has been at the forefront of federal and state policy development around farm and ranch land retention and protection since our founding, this is our first effort at a state policy scorecard. We know that there are many ways that states support agriculture, and this is not an attempt to score them all. In fact, as the director said, programs that address marketing opportunities, grants and loans, and other things that states do through economic development authorities and through financing. Many ways are states, and that includes Washington, providing support for the business of agriculture, and that is hugely important. We wanted to focus on 6 different types of policies and programs that tie directly to the land, but all of them address both the poorly planned development and generational transfer, and in some aspects, agricultural viability. So they include the purchase of agricultural conservation easement programs. These are often known as purchase of development right programs or farmland preservation programs. They're voluntary programs that compensate landowners who choose to place an agricultural conservation easement on their property. In Washington, these easements are purchased through the State Wildlife and Recreation Program, administered through the Recreation and Conservation Office. We looked at land use planning and growth management. We understand that land use planning is driven largely at the county and municipal level, and the suite of tools available to county and local governments to support compact development and protect agricultural land must be robust. But states can play an important role in steering and supporting these local decisions in a way that supports the agricultural land base, and Washington gets very high reviews for that. We looked at property tax relief for agricultural land. Property tax relief programs reduce property taxes paid on agricultural land in recognition that working lands require far less in municipal services than residential development. The most common approach is use value assessment. In Washington, we looked at the Open Space Taxation Act. Agricultural district programs, not something that Washington has, these often encourage landowners to form special areas to support agriculture. The protections and incentives offered differ by program. Some protect landowners by limiting what is allowed in terms of annexation. There are limits on eminent domain and protections from the siting of public facilities and infrastructure. Some ag district programs offer tax incentives, and some require district enrollment to participate in state PACE programs. We then looked at 2 policies and programs that we think are important for addressing that intergenerational transfer of land and creating new land opportunities for next-gen farmers. Farm Link programs connect farm seekers with farmers and landowners who want their land to stay in agriculture. They can be administered by public or private entities. They offer a range of services and resources from online real estate postings to technical assistance, trainings, and educational resources. And importantly for Washington State, since we know that there are many NGO administered efforts around farm linking, we did only look at state supported programs here. Lastly, we looked at state leasing programs, those that make state-owned land available to farmers and ranchers. Sometimes that's their primary purpose. More often, agricultural use is secondary to generating income for a public purpose or protecting wildlife habitat. So looking at how Washington scored, overall, a little below median on PACE, very close to the top on land use planning, and well above the median on property tax relief and state leasing. I'm looking at what time it is, so I'm only going to go through just a couple of these, I think. Let's start with PACE. Washington gets high marks for which you see. You can get to all of these on that drop-down menu that Beth is pointing out. So you go to PACE programs. And then if you go to the bottom, you also can see how we scored them and the factors that were included in the scores. And in that methodology thing, you'll see that it's all a weighted score and how we weighted the factors, but this basically shows what's included in these scores. So for Washington State, it gets high marks for its monitoring of the easements, which is great. The programs that score higher than Washington are investing more in their PACE programs, which in turn allows more easements per year and a greater percent of their ag land to be protected. Washington has invested 20 cents per capita on ag land protection, while some other states have invested several dollars per capita. So I want to stop and mention the Federal Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, which provides an important source of matching funds for farm and rangeland protection. We do hope that the $2 billion in funding and the key statutory changes made to ASEP in the 2018 Farm Bill, including elimination of the cash match requirement, will continue to improve their utility for farmland protection. And it's a subject that we'll be talking a lot more about through the National Agricultural Land Network. So let's look at land use planning. Again, here is where Washington shines through, again, as the director mentioned, with the Growth Management Act and several things from the 1990s, that requiring of local comprehensive planning and consistency between state goals and local plans is important, with mechanisms to ensure alignment between the two. And the footprint of new development is generally quite compact in the state, with under 0.2 acres developed for every new person added to the population between 1982 and 2012. I don't think we need to go again, given the time, but Washington gets pretty high marks for the percentage of agricultural land in its property tax relief program. Where other states score higher than Washington is in dedicating the withdrawal fees that are generated, which Washington appears to have as well. Some states dedicate those withdrawal fees to state or local farmland protection efforts. And then lastly, at state leasing, we know that Washington leases a lot of land through the Department of Natural Resources. Just one point, when you look at the score, you see a relatively low score on the assessment piece there. The states that have scored high in this category have done a comprehensive inventory of state-owned land that can be made available, and that's looking at land not just managed by natural resources agencies, but by all agencies within a state, because there is often land that might not be immediately thought of as available for agriculture, but could be made available, and some of it might be smaller parcels that would be suitable for beginning farmers and ranchers. So that's why we talk about state leasing in particular. So one last point on FarmLink and ag districts. Again, Washington doesn't have either of those things. We're not saying that it is essential. We do think for FarmLink that particularly given, and as everybody pointed out, the challenge of that generational transfer suggests that every state needs to do more in creating new land opportunities for next generation farmers and keeping that land in agriculture as it transfers from one generation to the next. And to get to the type of statewide robust programming around that, we feel that state support can be extremely valuable. So let me stop there. I hope it was a helpful cruise through the findings. If you do have questions, please write them down. And as we go out of the website, we're going to launch a poll, which asks which policy or policies you think would be most valuable to focus on for Washington. And my apologies, we only had 5 slots. So you do not see state leasing or farm linking here. I'm going to guess that might be something that people would want to say. If it is, feel free to write it in. And again, I think you can do multiple choice. You can do multiple answers. So let's take a minute and answer that, and then we'll continue. Okay, Beth, let's see what the answers are here. Great. Looking again at purchase VAG conservation easements and thinking about what further refinements, improvements, how to be more effective with getting that ASIP matching funds and land use planning. This is great. The National Ag Land Network is going to be doing a series of policy webinars beginning in early fall, which we hope will be a way for those of you who want to learn more about some of the specific policy elements and tools that we looked at in the scorecard. So going back to the PowerPoint, one thing missing from our spatial analysis is protected agricultural land. That is because there's not a national comprehensive data layer focused on agricultural land protection. We're building this new database now. If you have not heard from us and you hold agricultural conservation easements, please let us know by adding a comment in the question panel and we will be in touch with you. It's good to see we must have gotten some data from Washington because I see some nice green there, but we might well have missed you, so please be in touch. So let's now pause and see, Addie, if there are questions.
We have a lot of fantastic questions, and I wanted to start with one specifically for Director Sandison. The asker says, you mentioned demand for local food doubling. What is the time frame on that, and can you tell us more about where that data comes from?
Yeah, this is strictly related to COVID-19 and the stay home, stay safe order, and then the layoffs and furloughs that were associated with that. We saw demand at our food banks in Washington go from about 800,000 visits per month. In other words, again, this is aggregate statewide for all food banks, food pantries, almost overnight jumped to 1.6 million. And we're looking and managing this now in terms of being able to, again, provide resources necessary to support the food bank system around Washington. But we're seeing that demand increasing incrementally over, we've seen over the last several weeks. We're anticipating a spike in August for a number of reasons, including additional layoffs we're seeing around the state, plus the loss of the federal unemployment benefits at the end of July. This is something we know will have the elevated demand at Washington food banks through the end of, at least through the end of the year, probably longer. But again, putting this in perspective, we have a population of 7.5 million. We're serving 1.6 million at food banks right now.
Wow, those numbers are remarkable. Thanks for offering that background.
Sure.
Chris, I have a question that I think might be best for you to answer. And this is there's a series of nested questions here about what local county governments can do to stem farmland loss, support local farmers, and support the transition of farmland to the next generation. Do you want to talk about a couple of examples you've seen from other parts of the country?
Yeah, those are great questions. And I think channeling our colleague Julia Friedgood, I would say that part of it starts with good planning for agriculture at the county and local level to really understand what are the resources that you have, and then thinking about the agricultural land base in the context of those overall agricultural resources, the types of farms, the type of infrastructure that's needed. So it starts with the planning. There are a number of planning tools, again, thinking about urban growth boundaries. Again, since I'm less familiar with the specifics of Washington's Growth Management Act, it's a little hard to know sort of how that fits in, but some of those, again, the sort of traditional planning and zoning tools are ones that are, again, trying to do that compact development that is in close to a downtown area to put whatever development that there is on marginal soils, and then thinking about that also in the context of renewable energy, because that, again, is another issue that that communities are facing, is where to site renewable energy and where that can be done to keep it off of those most productive soils and put those onto marginally productive land is the more important there. In terms of generational transfer and what communities can do, I think where at either the county level or the local level to encourage discussion with your older farmers and agricultural landowners in terms of what are their hopes, to just bring people together to talk about that, maybe to have mixers where you're also bringing in next generation farmers and ranchers who are looking for opportunities to be trying to provide some of that matching and synergies. So those are a few things. I guess I should stop there.
Thanks, Chris. And I think that given the time, we should probably move on. I know that Director Sandison has to hop off a little bit early, so I wanted to say a sincere thanks for joining us today and bringing your perspective and your insight and being willing to support this work in Washington.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
There were a couple of questions about the report itself that I wanted to answer quickly before we move on to a last few slides. One question asked whether we have the ability to drill down into county level data. And we do have that data internally. We haven't published it in a sort of accessible, searchable format in the way that you see in the interactive map, but it's certainly it is work that we're interested in doing in the Pacific Northwest to help make some of that county level analysis available. Another person asked about sort of additional layers that consider how agriculture supports habitat range. And I wanted to offer that this version of Farms Under Threat is the second in a series, and that we are planning a next phase that will include more projections around climate change and impacts to agriculture, but also layers about habitat and wildlife. So know that it's something we are also thinking about and working toward. So given that, Beth, can we move on to the next couple slides? As you all know, time is not on our side in saving our farm and ranch land, and that's why AFT has announced a bold goal of doubling the amount of permanently protected farmland by 2040 and reducing the rate of farmland conversion from 2,000 acres a day to 500 acres a day by 2040. And we know that to get to this goal, we will need to join with the many partners and practitioners on this call and others around the country who are deeply concerned about saving the land that sustains us. I want to share just a couple of the ways that we are strengthening our commitment to this work. We are launching the National Agricultural Land Network, as you heard, which will provide ongoing education, peer networking, and other resources for land protection entities around the country. We're providing new leadership in key locations, protecting more farmland ourselves and with our partners, advocating for stronger state and federal policies, and promoting research-based decision-making. I wanted to make, next slide, a couple of points about things that Washington can specifically do. On a state level, we need to maintain existing funding and identify new funding to support farmland preservation. As Chris mentioned, the WWRP farmland account is currently the only state funding available to support protection of farmland, and it's a critical source for organizations doing the work. But we need to maintain that. And as we anticipate, as Director Sanderson mentioned, the long-term economic impacts of COVID, along with our aging farmer base, we also need to identify additional funding strategies to do this work. Secondly, providing funding for land access and farm viability programs. We talked a little bit about farm linking programs and the need to support those on a state level. And thirdly, to plan for agriculture, not just around it. We need to continue to develop state and local policies that promote smart growth and protect urban adjacent farmland, especially from that low density residential development we're seeing so much of. There's a lot more that we can do, and we will need to save that conversation for a future webinar. So Chris, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you. And I have been looking a little bit at other questions. And here's one for you, that this is about farm link programs. Is there any effort to assess organization-run programs in Washington State?
Fantastic question, and I don't have an answer off the top of my head. I think there are some fantastic nonprofits working in that space and doing a really good job of working in concert with one another. But I don't know of a sort of third-party effort to assess those programs.
Okay. Here's one that is, it's could you prioritize county level data availability by rate of farmland conversion in counties? This is from Clark County and a comp plan update cycle gearing up. And so this gets to the question of what level this data will be available. And I think that the answer is probably to fill out the form that we mentioned at the very beginning under that reports and data tab on the website. And I suspect that there is a way in that form that you can indicate what kind of information you're looking for. And there might be more, our GIS folks will be back in touch and can give you a better idea of what will be available and when. So I hope that's helpful. Addie, I'm going to take a minute to launch the last poll and talk about the Farmland Information Center and the network. And maybe we will have time for a couple more questions at the end then. So as we're thinking about the National Agricultural Network, it would be very helpful for us to understand what type of technical assistance would be most helpful to your agency, to your organization in addressing agricultural land conversion, because this is one of the things that the network is intended to do, is to build the collective capacity of practitioners, either who are working in the planning arena around planning related to agriculture, or who are in the farmland protection or farm and ranch land protection arena. So we are interested in tailoring the network's programming to meet what people feel are their highest needs and interests. So that's why we're asking this question. And again, you can vote for more than one. So Okay, what are we seeing, Beth? All right, that is very helpful on the ag protection plans. That is going to be a focus, again, as will the policy tools, and useful to know that both land access and more discussions around conservation easements and ASEP will be helpful. So thank you for that. So let me talk for a minute about the Farmland Information Center, which is a collaboration we've had with USDA's NRCS for decades. It is both a website and it is a technical assistance provider. So we do that by answering emails and by answering the phone, and we do both of those very quickly. So if you are looking for statistics around farm or ranch land, if you are looking for information about state policies, if you want examples of local land use planning tools, that is an area actually we're going to beef up our programming and information on the Farmland Information website over the next couple of months. There's a lot of information in there around approaches to land access. We have a farmland protection directory, so that if there is a farmer or a rancher who is interested in protecting his or her land, we both will provide information around agricultural conservation easements, the benefits of doing that, and sending them to either land trusts or state or county programs if they are interested in pursuing those protection options. So that's the FIC. I very much encourage people to go to look at the website. It's farmlandinfo.org. It's got a great wealth of information. And the National Ag Land Network, again, this is geared to practitioners. We really want to expand our peer networking and information sharing. Many folks are doing many great things around the country. We are excited that Melissa Campbell from PCC Farmland Trust is on the steering committee for the network. And we will be rolling out a number of different types of webinars and informational tools that we hope will be helpful. It is a membership entity. Membership is free. You can find out more information by going to the website at farmland.org/NALN. And so let me turn it back to you, Addie. I don't know if we have time to answer any more questions or if you just want to do a wrap up.
Well, I think a great final question to address, Chris, would be how land trusts and other conservation organizations can use the data in farms and under threat to inform their own restoration and conservation work.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll take a stab at it, and then I'd love your thoughts. I think that number one, you can use it to help make the case, depending on where you are, to be able to show to municipal, county government officials sort of that there is this documented conversion of both types and the need for, again, for those land use planning tools. So we think that it's a helpful make the case, and that's also making the case at the state level in terms of types of state policy changes that are important. Then I think it helps to identify, again, land that is both the most vulnerable and land that is most productive. Now, we understand that all agricultural land has value and that there are times when you want to think about protection for reasons that are not related to its productivity. What we're saying here is not to ignore the productivity of agricultural land, because it is and will only continue to become more important in the future. So thinking about it in terms of your lens of land protection and how that productive land fits into how you think about land protection efforts. So let me stop there, and you add anything else that you want to that.
I think you said it really well, and we are at time. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. and being a part of this conversation. You asked really thoughtful, valuable questions. I appreciate that, and know that we will follow up with everyone who registered by sending out links to the report as well as a link to this recording.
Great, thank you. And everybody have a great rest of the day. Thank you for joining us.